So please welcome aviation historian and author Paul Harrison to deliver the 2020 Jean Batten Address.
I've conned Des into doing the slide bit, so if anything goes wrong, his problem. So while he's setting up, I'll just... Jean Batten is interesting because when I was at Tauranga Boys College, I was in Batten House. So that was my first association with Jean Batten. And in 1979, I had the privilege of being the escort officer for her when she visited RNZAF Wigram, including a walk round one Grumman Avenger. So there was the tie-in there. I was asked to do this presentation and the primary notes were done by Brian Lockstone with additional information from myself. So when he finds it, we'll start off. But I'm a Tauranga boy. Was born in Tauranga and was educated in Rotorua, Greymouth, and then back to Tauranga. And then at the early age of 16, my father said, "What are you doing next year, son?" And I said, "I'm not really sure, Dad." He said, "Sign here." And the next thing, I was at boys' school at Woodburn, along with Jack Best. We were the last of the boy entrants. But that was a great introduction to the Air Force because it was a whole year in which you were given your military grounding. So unlike your standard recruit courses, which are 6 weeks, we had a whole year of learning which our left and right foot was. There we go. So think of those, not at the moment, but in normal times, those thousands of Aucklanders that go to and from Auckland International Airport. How many of them do you think, as they drive down the George Bolt Memorial Drive, think, who was George Bolt? Very few, I would take it. There's also a George Bolt Street at Rongotai in Wellington. Again, the people that transit up and down that street every day would say, well, who's George Bolt? Well, let's find out who George Bolt was. Next. So there we go, George Bruce Bolt. Largely unknown beyond the narrow circle, George Bolt is one of the handful of pioneers who did so much to launch aviation in New Zealand as a model aeroplane maker, engineer, pilot and airline management. His career spanned 2/3 of the 20th century, from the first days of heavier than air aviation in New Zealand and across the wider world to the United States of America. Next. Throughout this presentation you'll see quotes from various people about George Bolt's qualifications and his respect that he drew through New Zealand for his aviation expertise. We can divide his aviation career into 4 groups. The first involved aero modelling and gliding. The second, his work with New Zealand Flying School at Mission Bay in Auckland, and then civil aviation in the 1930s. His wartime service with the Royal New Zealand Air Force, and finally his time with Tasman Empire Airways Limited as chief engineer. But what of Bolt as an individual? He was tall, sparse. His younger days, his hair was a reddish bronze colour and mostly unkempt, as you will see later on. Of quiet demeanour, he was self-effacing, some say taciturn. Although he was shy, he was always slow to take credit. Unlike so many of today's leaders, he believed that if you led, you automatically assume responsibility. So often did this happen throughout his working life, the best examples being during the forced grounding of the TEAL short Sandringham flying boats in 1948, but more of this later. Bolt was born in Dunedin on the 24th of May 1893. His grandfather came from the Shetlands off Scotland and originally inhabited by the Vikings. Perhaps this is where he inherited his hair, along with his industry, energy and quiet commitment. Inspired by the early balloonists and parachutists, Bolt began designing and building his own small balloons before turning to model aeroplanes. He was an earlier subscriber to Flight, the British aviation journal founded in 1909. We tend to regard globalisation as a contemporary phenomenon, but no, it was alive and well even in that Edwardian decade before the First World War. So it was that many New Zealand pioneers, including poor Richard Pearce, were exchanging information with acquaintances and contacts overseas, even though it would take months to exchange letters. Bolt had a circle of enthusiastic friends who in January 1909 formed the Canterbury Aero Club to further their interests. Others included W.M. Angus, later a First World War airman, and Noah Johansen, the balloonist, and his wife. They built rubber-powered model aeroplanes and were featured in the 23rd November 1912 issue of Flight magazine. Alongside the models, their thoughts turned to gliding. In that fact, issue of Flight alluded to this aspect. Bolt drew on overseas magazines and advised to design his own machine, a biplane with a wingspan of 27 feet or 9 metres. It was first flown from the Cashmere Hills on the 23rd of December 1911, when 4 club members took it by bicycle to the site and made its first flight of about 60 feet or 20 metres and barely off the ground. Fortunately, one of the club members had a camera and this historic event was recorded for history. Bolt commenced his formal engineering instruction by working in the engineering department of a major hardware store in Christchurch, where his enthusiasm attracted the attention of the leading tradesmen who taught him about tools, metals and their treatment. This was followed by evening classes at the Christchurch Technical School. From gliders he began planning for powered flight and designed a glider capable of powered flight. It had swept-back wings and the initial version was to be pedal-powered. He began making his own engine of 12 horsepower and cast the crankcase in his long-suffering mother's kitchen. The outbreak of the war, World War I, brought an end to the club and Bolt's aviation activities. He remained working in the engineering department but wanted to learn to fly. There were no clubs, no training facilities in the Christchurch area. However, in Auckland, Leo and Vivian Walsh, who built the Howard Wright biplane Manuera and first flew it for the first time on the 5th of February 1911, had turned their minds to training and in September 1915 formed the New Zealand Flying School and leased the old Selwyn Mission building at Mission Bay. In those days, the overall area was known as Kohimarama. On the 21st of February 1916, the school was granted imperial recognition to train pilots to standards laid down by the Royal Aero Club and before being sent to Britain for additional training and service in the Royal Flying Corps or the Royal Naval Air Service. The second school, the Canterbury New Zealand Aviation Company, formed by Sir Henry Wigram at Sockburn, started training in June of 1917. By the end of the war, the Walsh Brothers New Zealand Flying School had trained 110 pilots and Canterbury 182. The Walsh Brothers purchased a damaged Caudron biplane from JWH Scotland, another pioneer who had flown it during 1914 in both North and South Islands, and put it on floats. This joined the flying boat the Walsh brothers had designed and built themselves. One of the first 2 pupils to be trained was Keith Caldwell, a bank clerk who went on to become New Zealand's top-scoring fighter pilot with 25 victories during World War I. Clearly the school had done its job properly. Aviation in 1915 was expensive as it is today in relative terms. To enrol in the New Zealand Flying School required payment of a fee of £100, worth about $5,000 today, and this was far beyond Bolt and his family. However, an aunt had married well, and this gentleman, who made his fortune from land and property in the United Kingdom, took an interest in George and took him to Auckland to meet the Walsh brothers. George's benefactor must have had a way with words, for on the 5th of June 1916, George was enrolled at the flying school as an apprentice mechanic and would meet his instructor's costs from his pay. he was also he was given a tent to live in on site. So Bolt soon proved his versatility, and Ted Harvey recalled how he modified a Lerone engine to make it run more efficiently. He turned his attention to an Anzini 10-cylinder two-row radial, which he quickly sorted out for the installation in a Walsh single-seat flying boat. He was a man of many skills, a keen photographer, designer and builder of propellers called air screws. He was well known within the circles up there for his skill at building propellers from scratch, which is no mean task if you understand how propellers are built up. He was a keen tuner of the many motorcycles owned by students at the school. The early aircraft at the Flying School had only limited instruments, generally an oil pressure gauge and an engine RPM indicator. Bolt devised an airspeed indicator along with mounting a cord ahead of the pilot to indicate slip and yaw. A month after he joined, he began his flying instruction. This was regularly interrupted by his mechanics duties. However, he finally managed the flight before military observers on the 24th of May 1917, which would result in his pilot's certificate and employment as an instructor. And there's his pilot's certificate. This resulted in a modest pay increase. His starting pay was 27 shillings and sixpence per week, minus 20 shillings for flight instruction. Now he was an instructor, his weekly wage rose to 30 shillings.
So you got that on his actual birthday?
Yeah. Much of 1918 was taken up with instruction. On the 29th of September, he made the first aerial delivery of mail and papers with a run to Tuhi Island and back, a total flight time of 11 minutes. This was only the beginning of a series of increasing long-distance flight by which he extended his already formidable reputation. And you can see here he wrote, well, you can see that he wrote to his mother. He wrote to his mother every week. And in the George Bolt Pioneer Aviator book, a lot of those letters are reproduced, and they make quite interesting reading. Consider this. On Saturday, I raised the record to 35 trips in one day. 35 instructional trips in one day? These days, a modern GA flight instructor could probably hack 2. But of course, a lot of these were fairly short. They might have been 20 minutes or so because the aircraft were quite limited. But still, 35 trips in one day is a lot of pressure on an instructor. Right.
And especially considering 35 different students as well.
Correct.
So completely different
Approach.
abilities to handle
Yep.
the airplane.
Yeah, yeah.
That's huge.
Individual approaches to their ability. A highlight of the year was the arrival of the school's new Boeing and Westervelt seaplanes. These came by sea aboard the Niagara, which was welcomed and photographed by Bolt, the second of the school's Walsh Curtis flying boat coded C. So that's E, which was these were assembled at Mission Bay and flown during January 1918, the first coded F, making its flight at the end of the month. The second G did not fly to May. These are the Walsh boats. The interesting thing is they had some engine changes which Bolt carried out and improved with bigger, better performing engines. So when you look at the photographs of these various flying boats and in different references, you've got to look very careful to see which engine is fitted to work out the period of time that photograph was taken in. So you can see there, so there's F. Business was slowing down, occasioned by the end of the war in November 1918, although training did not formally end until late April 1919. Bolt took his mother for her first flight in May, which would have been one of the first female flights in New Zealand, a very brave lady. It was during 1919 that Bolt and the school made contact with the Catholic Bishop of Auckland, the Right Reverend Dr. H.W. Cleary, who became what we might call today a frequent flyer. Dr. Cleary was a remarkable man. He had served on the Western Front as a chaplain where he was wounded, and his service was recognised by the award of an OBE. He was a prolific author, writing and speaking fluent Maori. He was very much a modern man and used both cars and the aeroplane to tour his wide diocese, which ran from Northland to the Bay of Plenty. He paid a visit to the school in March 1918 and discussed with Bolt the possibility of using an aircraft to get round his diocese. And there is Mr. Cleary in the front of one of the flying boats. Bolt took him on a short flight in the Boeing, which came to an abrupt halt after 3 minutes with an engine failure. They put down on the harbour and had to be towed ashore. The bishop looked at the damage and said, well, that's a pity, and promptly booked a flight for the following day to Mercury Bay. It would be the first of many, so obviously wasn't going to be put off by a small inconvenience. The same month, a British delegation led by Colonel A.V. Bettingham arrived in New Zealand to advise the government on air defence. He presented a comprehensive plan involving 7 squadrons, 1 aircraft depot and 2 aircraft parks. But this proved all too expensive for a government coping with the post-war recovery. Shipped out with him were de Havilland DH-4 light bombers and 2 Bristol F-2B fighters. In London, a group of businessmen, air-minded citizens, was formed. This became known as the Imperial Gift Committee, which offered war surplus aircraft to the Dominions to foster development of air forces. New Zealand was offered 100 aircraft, but the government took time to make up its mind. Others raided the kitty, and only 35 were selected. 20 Avro 504K trainers, 9 DH-9A light bombers and 6 flying boats. Even then, the government was too late, and only 20 of the Avros and 9 DH-9s, less powerful than the 9A, arrived. The 2 Avros were retained, and the remainder leased to 3 companies: the New Zealand Flying School, the Canterbury Aviation Company, and a new enterprise, the New Zealand Aero Transport Company, based in Timaru, and destined to become our small, oblique, short-lived airline. They pressed their aircraft into service, training a few pilots, offering joyrides, and in the case of the New Zealand Flying School, making pioneer air mail deliveries. Meantime, Bolt commenced setting new distance records. And there's the first newspaper delivery, an air mail. Does anybody see that recent TV bit about the replicating the flight from Christchurch to Trentham?
Yes.
Where a certain gentleman claimed that was the first time air mail had been flown in New Zealand. He needs to do a bit more research. So there we go. The first came on 31 May 1919 when he flew the Boeing seaplane F from Auckland to Russell in the Bay of Islands and returned in a flight time of 2 hours 45 minutes. He followed this up on the 16th of December 1919 when he took the Boeing to Dargaville and back in 2 hours 58 minutes. Bolt flew the first experimental airmail service from Auckland to Thames and returned on the 24th of February 1920. A second airmail flight to Whangarei followed on the 1st of March, with further flights to Dargaville on the 8th and the 11th of March. Remember that in those days the roads were limited, narrow and unsealed. Coastal shipping was the primary means of transport. These days it's difficult to imagine the excitement and the interest generated by these new high-speed mail services. In early March, Bishop Cleary was recovering from a serious illness, and it was decided to meet his scattered flock in the Bay of Plenty. On the 12th of March, Bolt and the Bishop departed Queen's Wharf, Auckland, in the Boeing F, carrying mailbags, and headed to Tauranga. Anybody recognise where it is? The Strand. The interesting thing in this photograph is you look carefully right in the background, you can see the piers for the railway bridge just being built. Yeah. They dropped the mailbag over Port Charles, then followed the coast around to Bowen Town entrance to Tauranga Harbour, where they landed 2 hours and 19 minutes after leaving Auckland. A crowd greeted them and the children had been given the day off school. The bishop handed over a mailbag containing 240 letters and speeches were made. The first flight here is what we are remembering today, the first visit of an aircraft to the Bay of Plenty. After a short stop, they headed to Whakatane to deliver mail and then had lunch at the Commercial Hotel. At 2:25 p.m, they landed at Potiki, where Bolt took a rest while the bishop went about his clerical duties. a very interesting quote about the reception he got from the locals. At 9:28 the following morning, they took off and carried 100 letters for Auckland, leaving for Whakatane, then Tauranga, where they landed at 1:08 p.m. Another overnight stop, more speeches and ceremonies. While the bishop was busy, Bolt took an elderly Maori for his first flight. He was around 90 years of age, a veteran of the early land wars, and Bolt reported him pretty active. Look at the kids. Hey, look, an aeroplane. Next morning they were aloft at 6:47 a.m. and reached Auckland at 8:43. In Harvey's book, he says Bishop Cleary told the Auckland Star that travelling at 60 miles an hour or more through the clean and dustless upper air provides a tonic effect. Who amongst us today wouldn't share that view? No enclosed cockpits in there, the wind was there and you could look over the side and watch the world go past. The bishop made several flights to the north and the west coast before his untimely death in 1929. And now here's a story that's a bit unusual in aviation history. I'll let you read it. I have seen a photograph, which I haven't been able to find again, of the seaplane, the embankment and the steam engine all in the same frame. Yeah, I saw it many years ago and I've never been able to find it again, but yeah, good Kiwi initiative. One of the most enthusiastic supporters of this new means of travel was Colonel Alan Bell of Northland. He often flew with George Bolt around the north and to Auckland. And that's next quote. Yeah. So he, again, was an obvious enthusiast. Back to those experimental mail flights, and Bolt made 5, and in mid-1921 the Post and Telegraph Department awarded the Walsh brothers a 3-month contract to provide 6 mail flights each week. Sadly, support was not forthcoming and the service was terminated at the end of July. By then, Bolt had been appointed chief pilot of the school. In August 1920, the school took delivery of the first of 5 Avro 504Ks. This machine, serialled F9745, was converted by the staff into a 3-seater, thus doubling the revenue obtainable on every flight. The aircraft became very familiar around the North Island. The interesting point of this photograph is it's a little bit blurry, but if you can see on the side of the aircraft is a big white patch with the words Royal Mail. The significance of carrying that, as you can see in the bottom, goes back to 1516 when King Henry VIII created the Royal Mail Seal, which meant that a company appointed to Royal Mail delivery was sanctioned by the King and was the official deliverer. So the Royal Mail there, you know, where else have we seen Royal Mail on transport? A lot of the TEAL aircraft, NAC aircraft, right? And the old Royal Mail crest on it.
Actually, TEAL used to have RMA, for the name of the aircraft, they named it RMA ATRO.
Yeah, and some of the ships were the same, RMS, you know, Royal Mail steamer. Yeah, so there you go. Okay.
British Airways aircraft
Still carry this.
carry
Yep.
that.
Yeah.
There's not many do, I believe British Airways aircraft still
Yeah.
do.
Sadly, F9745 came to a tragic end at New Plymouth on Remembrance Day, the 11th of November that year, in 1920, when flown by Captain Richard Russell, who had graduated from the school on the 31st of August 1917. He managed to stall the aircraft and spun into the ground. He and his 2 passengers died in the crash. In 1919, the school decided to import a supermarine Channel flying boat. It arrived on the 17th of March and Bolt promptly decided to replace its 160 horsepower Beadmore engine with a 230 horsepower Armstrong Siddeley Puma taken from a DH9 which the school had never flown. It undertook several commercial flights, but is best remembered for the first Auckland to Wellington flight on the 4th of October 1920. Bolt was at the controls and he had two passengers, Leo Walsh, who was the manager of the school, and Bob Johnson. They landed at Kawhia and Wanganui before reaching the capital after a flight of 5 hours and 6 minutes. And there it is. It's a familiar Wellington scene, isn't it? Not unexpectedly, the flight generated much attention. On landing, the Channel and Bolt were greeted by the Harbour Board, the Air Board of the military forces, the City Council and members of Parliament. For their pains, the three were made members of the Commercial Travellers Association. They intended spending about 3 weeks in Wellington and hoping to raise revenue from flights beginning at £2, but during the night of the 24th of October, the channel was overturned by heavy winds and had to be recovered by Wellington's floating crane, which still is at Wellington, the Hikatea. Repairs proved difficult and the channel was returned to Auckland by rail, where it was rebuilt at the school. Its next significant venture involved a contract with the British government through its Western Pacific Commission, which administered the territories of the region, including Fiji and the New Hebrides, then jointly administered as a condominium shared with France. So go back to a nice picture of George. It was required to conduct survey flights around Fiji area, and the channel was taken by ship with Captain A.C. Uppen and another NZFS Flying School graduate as pilot, and Leo White. This proved financially worthwhile. The channel made several flights around the northern parts of New Zealand, remembered perhaps for its unsuccessful attempt flown by Bolt to drop life-saving gear to Great Barrier Island on the 22nd of June 1922 after the wreck of the liner Wiltshire. On the 8th of December, Bolt made return flights with the channel to Onarahi, then Thames, carrying copies of the New Zealand Herald with the results of the previous day's election. This, of course, was long before radio and TV news. In 1923, the government passed legislation setting up the New Zealand Permanent Air Force and a territorial-based New Zealand Air Force as part of the New Zealand Military Forces. In February, both the established schools began refresher training. The New Zealand Flying School catered for seaplanes and flying boats, while the Canterbury Aviation Company looked after land-based pilots. Bolt was appointed Chief Instructor at Auckland, and on the 24th of March 1923, took an aerial stuntman, Albert Eastwood, aloft in one of the 504Ks and dropped him by parachute over the Ellerslie racecourse, the first such descent in New Zealand from an aircraft. The days of both flying schools were approaching the end, with dwindling demands for flying training and joyriding. On 21st of June, the Canterbury Company was taken over by the government, and its aircraft and airfield formed the basis of the new air forces. For his pains, Bolt was appointed to the reserve of officers with the rank of lieutenant on the 30th December, remembering that until 1929, the Air Force ranks were all Army. It was only in 1929 that the Air Force adopted RAF ranks. For the New Zealand Flying School, there was nothing left. It ceased on the 24th of October 1923. Settlement took until the following September with a modest payment for the aircraft, which were then taken over into storage at an Army facility at North Head, or so we believe. The Supermarine Channel languished for 3 years before being broken up, and its hull became a flying boat. And there's the caretakers of the flying school. With the demise of the New Zealand Flying School, Bolt's aviation career was suspended and he returned to engineering and had to wait until the rebirth of civil aviation, hasted by the first flight across the Tasman Sea by Sir Charles Kingsford Smith in 1928. Salvation came in 1928 when F. Maurice Clark and Mad Mac McGregor formed Dominion Airways. Clark had learned to fly with the Canterbury Aviation Company, while Mac was an accomplished airman with First World War experience. George Bolt was appointed pilot and technical advisor. The company had an impressive list of directors, including Jack Newman of Nelson, Newman's Buses, later well known in ground transport and airline businesses in the 1980s. There was also Matthew, later Sir Matthew Oram, of Palmerston North, a barrister and solicitor who entered Parliament and became a respected speaker. So we're now on to land the planes in a big way. Bolt was a confirmed seaplane and flying boat aviator. The company sent him to Britain to check out the Saro Windhover, a 6-seater seaplane. It proved a disappointment and a DeSoto 2, registered ZK-ACA, was purchased. This ended service between Hastings and Gisborne and made at least 100 flights with mixed commercial returns. This was being overhauled when the Napier earthquake struck on the 3rd of February 1931. Every effort was made to complete the task, and Bolt flew several flights carrying mails and telegrams which could not be transmitted as the lines were down. An interesting photograph, you can see it's actually signed by George Bolt. 5 days later, Ivan Knight, one of the directors who had trained but not qualified as a pilot, decided to fly the DeSoto himself. While circling low to drop mails over Wairoa, the aircraft stalled and crashed, killing Knight and his 2 passengers. The company closed immediately and Bolt was once more out of a job. He found employment with the Goodwin Chichester Aviation Company as a pilot. One task was to demonstrate the Avro Avian biplane around the country, as the company had secured the New Zealand agency, and that was through Mills at Hobsonville. He was the introducer to this particular enterprise. The company folded probably because of the fierce competition from the de Havilland 60 Moth imported by Mills, so he actually was also working in competition, Air Survey and Transport Company. And yet another quote. Bolt moved to the capital to take up employment with the Wellington Aero Club as instructor and engineer. In this capacity, he was sent by the club to the United States to inspect new types suitable for air taxi and air ambulance services. Oh, got some sound. Interesting. If you read the caption, does anybody understand the relationship of that caption? It's a bit of author licence by Hugh Gardner, but in 1930 the Schneider Trophy was won by Flight Lieutenant Atherley of the RAF. The first time the RAF had won the Schneider Trophy. And of course George Bolt was a seaplane pilot. And this guy took a little bit of licence and sort of linked the two things together, saying that he's the Schneider Trophy pilot of New Zealand. So, nice thoughts. It was from here that he returned to commercial aviation, and when he was appointed Chief Pilot and Technical Advisor to Cook Strait Airways Limited, taking up the post on the 20th of February 1935. The airline was formed by the Union Steamship Company, Newman Brothers and the Anchor Shipping and Foundry Company in October 1934 to provide air services between Wellington and Nelson, complementing the owner's ship services. Bolt went to Britain and selected the DH-89 Rapide for the fleet. Orders were placed for 2, with seating reduced from 8 to 6 to provide space for passengers' luggage. Both were equipped with wireless telegraphy equipment. And there's a line up at the old Rongotai. The company flourished, building patronage and fleet numbers up until the outbreak of the Second World War, when its aircraft were taken into the RNZF as navigation and wireless operator trainers. The company ceased, but Bolt then began his next important phase, called up from the reserves to become a wing commander in the wartime RNZAF. And there he is at Hobsonville. He became Senior Engineering Officer at one aircraft assembly depot at Hobsonville, responsible for the erection and assembly of the hundreds of aircraft flooding in from overseas to equip the wartime Air Force. And there's a whole stash of Oxfords, and so 1308 was taken on charge of the 19th of August 1940, so that photo was probably taken very shortly after it was assembled. Interesting point about the Harvard. The Harvard was the first aircraft type that George had been associated with in his long career to date. that had a variable pitch propeller and a retractable undercarriage. Everything else he had flown, if you think about it, had fixed undercarriages and fixed props. So he was coming into the modern age. In 1943, he moved to headquarters in Wellington as the Director of Aeronautical Production, where duties included overall supervision of local manufacturing of aircraft and spare parts. The airline industry called, and when the post of Chief Engineer at Tasman Empire Airways Limited became vacant, he applied. He was actually shoulder tapped, and joined the company in 1944. TEAL had formed in 1938 and made its first scheduled flight on the 30th of April 1940. It had two Short Brothers S-30 Empire-class flying boats. These were reliable and strong, but throughout the war were plagued by the shortage of engine and airframe spares, understandably, as Auckland was about as far away from the UK manufacturers. I'm going to do a quick diversion here, my friend. George's son, Richard, if people know the history about these flying boats during the war, one of them was bringing Peter Fraser back from the States and was shot up by some US Marine and US naval aircraft. Fortunately, they waved a white singlet out of the cockpit window and they ceased and desisted. But there was quite a few holes were punched in the port main plane. And Richard Bolt, who is of a very similar build to George Bolt, was an apprentice engineer at TEAL at the time, and he was small enough to crawl inside the wing space and hold the dolly while they repaired the patch. Yeah, told me that many years ago. Right, next slide. Interesting slide in that somebody's colourised it. The significance of the colours were based on the European agreement that civil aircraft, being neutral, would carry orange upper main planes, and blue, white, the British coloured stripes across the bottom of the main plane, and a red stripe, and red, white and blue around the rear fuselage. All very nice, except the Japanese hadn't signed that particular agreement, so it's just as well they didn't run into any Japanese. Bolt, as it said, worked miracles keeping both airliners in the air, improvising and manufacturing spares as appropriate. Air Department was indulgent in terms of granting approvals because of his reputation. So there he is, Chief Engineer. After the war, the company's directors decided to stay with flying boats despite the rapid advance of modern airliners such as the Lockheed Constellation and the Douglas DC-4. TEAL's general manager by then was Geoffrey Roberts. Wanted the latter, in other words land plane, but he was overruled. Bolt was obviously delighted as a flying boat man. And there he is flying AMA. So you can see the huge, great view from the cockpit and those things, isn't it? Must have got terribly sunburnt at times. 4 short flying boats, Short Brothers S-25 Sandringhams, were ordered as temporary equipment pending the arrival of the company's Solents in 1949. The Sandringhams were second-hand and had already had a hard life as Sunderland Mark V's with the Royal Air Force chasing U-boats. At least 2 had made open sea landings in the North Atlantic, and one of the interesting things is when one of them arrived in New Zealand, they found a whole lot of concrete in the hull where a temporary patch had been made and never been fixed. So, right. My colleague Brian Lockstone recalls discussing them with Bolt, who remembered how when the second arrived, yeah, as I said, that's where they found the concrete in it. The Sandringhams proved problematic. Although comfortable and spacious, offered 30 seats compared with 19 in the S-30s. They had a series of engine overheating problems. There was no fault of the Pratt & Whitney R1830s, rather the cowling and cooling arrangements. We've gone one past, have we got AMEs back, has it? One back? Oh yeah, there it is. And this was the aircraft that brought things to a head. When AME was en route Auckland to Sydney on the 3rd of December 1947 with 29 passengers, including 3 children and a crew of 6, it had to shut down engine number 3 after it began backfiring, vibrating severely and throwing out oil. Captain Ian Patterson could not maintain height. When the Sandringham was only 100 feet above the sea, he ordered 1,500 pounds of baggage and cargo jettisoned and life jackets to be worn. An SOS was sent and the RAAF prepared a Catalina and a B-24 to assist. He made it to Rose Bay where a strip down by Qantas found an aluminium exhaust valve pushrod had failed, damaging both the pushrod and the valve box casings. At first this seemed to be one of those inevitable problems, but subsequent inquiries turned up much more damaging information. 12 days after the event, the Minister of Civil Aviation in New Zealand imposed a £2,000 reduction in all-up weight. Faced with increasing public concern, the government ordered a commission of inquiry chaired by Professor T.D.J. Leach, Director of the School of Engineering at Auckland University. Sitting with him was Group Captain George Watt, Director of Engineering in the RNZF, and Captain Oscar Gardner, recently retired from TEAL. They had to answer several questions which include why the engine had failed, did the Sandringham meet performance standards set down in certifications, performance of the crew, and what steps should be taken to ensure the service could operate safely. Their inquiries and public hearings disclosed some alarming aspects, the biggest being the nature of certification of the aircraft in Britain and the performance of both the British authorities and Short Brothers, and George Bolt was the centre of this whole discussion going on. So you can see he's a worried lad. Once in New Zealand, the Sandringhams have been granted a certificate of airworthiness since the Civil Aviation Branch of Air Department was obligated to recognise British certification. However, the aircraft had arrived without a type record on which the certification was based, and none could be located in Britain. Then, TEAL had replaced the original de Havilland hydromatic propellers with Hamilton standard paddle blade props, which turned more slowly and lowered the high noise experienced by the float crew. TEAL had not sought air department approval, thus rendering the certificates of airworthiness invalid. The British Aerial dismissed overheating, noting that the R1830s had been used all around the world with no noticeable heating issues. On the 22nd of February, Roberts called managers together to review the situation. Bolt produced a list of 11 major engine failures from March 1947. Accordingly, the Sandringhams were grounded from that date and the airline scrambled to assemble charter flights. Bolt and his team soon worked out the source of the problem. The main planes of the Sandringham Sunderland had a 5-degree sweep back, with the engines mounted at right angles and therefore not directly in line with the airflow. They reworked cooling baffles and took the revolutionary step of shifting the carburetor intake from within the cowl to on top of the cowl. Test flights with British observers on board confirmed the results and the Sandringhams returned to service. Bolt carried some criticism from the government of inquiry, which had castigated the company for not employing more engineers. Bolt had only limited paperwork backing his work experience and most of his staff were tradesmen. The Commission was also critical of the company's manuals. So there we go. We're starting to get into the heavy stuff now. So Bolt pressed on, overseeing the first introduction of solvents in 1949 and disposal of the Sandringhams, moving the TEAL maintenance base to Mechanics Bay. What he basically did was that all of the heavy maintenance was done at Hobsonville in the hangar down on the Hard at Hobsonville, and George Bolt designed this hangar, which they erected at Mechanics Bay. Bolt pressed. Then finally, in 1954, introduction of the Douglas DC-6, which would spell the end of his beloved flying boats. He retired as the company was planning the DC-6 replacement. There we go. He had a strong interest in history in the Museum of Transport and Technology and was responsible for the last Solent ZK AMO to be presented to MOTAT. By one of those ironies, his only son Richard, by then an Air Commodore in the RNZF, secured a Sunderland for MOTAT. His son, a wartime Pathfinder pilot, later became the Chief of Air Staff and then Chief of Defence Staff. Bolt also did much research into the experience of Richard Pearce, and over the South Canterbury aviation enthusiast who designed and built his own machines. Over several years, Bolt recovered some of his equipment along with his last design, which never flew, and brought them to MOTAT for study. He spent a lot of time down around the Christchurch area with Pearce's relatives, recovering a lot of the Pearce bits and pieces from dumps and garages and things like that. So he really went out of his way to try and preserve that stuff. However, after all of the studies of Pearce and what Pearce has claimed to do, Richard Bolt never claimed that Pearce had flown before the Wright brothers as a controlled flight. His other passion was clocks. In his retirement years, he spent a lot of time repairing and manufacturing clocks. Some of his collection was passed to the Auckland War Museum. Never a robust individual, Bolt died at the age of only 70 in Auckland on the 27th of July 1963, and New Zealand lost one of those single-minded individuals who had done so much to advance New Zealand aviation but never claimed the limelight. The airline world mourned his passing. And that's a very good quote from Ian Driscoll on his death.
Things about George Bolt. Talking about 1960 or 61, my father was engineer for Fred Ladd Tourist Air Travel at Mechanics Bay, and I was at secondary school and I would work there in the weekends and school holidays. And George Bolt had a habit of coming down and joining us during the lunch hour with his sandwiches. And he told us quite a bit about the excavations that were going on in South Canterbury for Pearce's motor and propeller out of the river down there, Opie River.
Yep, yep.
And he also said that he thought Auckland should have a transport museum, and he was working on the Auckland City Council to get one established at Western Springs.
Yep.
And he brought his zither along, and he would sit that on his lap and pluck the strings while he was eating his sandwiches. And I remember him as a very gentle, humble man.
Yeah. We've got those two videos too.
Did you want to do them?
Yeah. Got a couple of short video clips which are interesting because they actually feature George Bolt. When we put, there we go.
Designing, planning and construction of new aircraft continued through into 1916, funded from the fees paid by the flood of applicants itching to learn to fly the aircraft now based at Mission Bay. Young George Bolt couldn't afford the fees, but he was dying to learn to fly. He sought advice from his rich uncle Joe Horn, who approached the Walshes. After much negotiation, George was given a job as an apprentice mechanic. He was expected to work all the hours necessary for 27 shillings and sixpence a week, with a tenth thrown in for living quarters. 20 shillings a week went back to the flying school to cover tuition fees. By July 1916, he was flying solo. Bolt was to have an enormous influence on the development of the aviation industry in New Zealand throughout a long career.
Paul, it's on behalf of all the people here this evening. We'd just like to thank you for what's been a very informative well-researched presentation. I was just noted with interest that when you said George Bolte was getting his licence from, the licence you brought up on there was from Great Britain.
Yeah,
And,
all the licences were issued by Great Britain
yeah,
at that
so it
time.
wasn't until 1918 that we actually had our first Act to Control Civil Aviation, so we could, and the aircraft was registered as an F, so there was no, and in subsequent ones you've got the ZK, things like that. So thank you very much for that. I also would like to just acknowledge that as well as being a historian, you're actually in the current, looking at current issues and future issues, and there was an article in the New Zealand Aviation News that came out on Monday, which was looking at the future for Kapiti Airport, and a really well-researched issue that's actually not just looking backwards, but actually looking forwards.
Did you like the last sentence though?
I can't remember the last one.
Let the games begin.
Yes, okay.
Because for those that don't know about it, the owners want to sell it all and turn it into residential and commercial.
And just as perhaps an appropriate acknowledgement, the book here, it's from, there's a person who was born in Whakatane in 1917, and he was here in 1918, so he would have been here when George Bolte and the Bishop arrived, and that's Alf Rendell.
Yes, I know Alf.
And Alf, so before the Second World War, Alf was a photographer in Tauranga. During the Second World War, he was a military photographer in the Pacific, and from 1945, and I think you must have been born about 1948.
47, in fact, Rendell's photography.
Yeah.
I used to know the family quite well.
Yeah. So Alf was taking pictures from a tiger moth over Tauranga from about 1945 to 1954, and so it's an appropriate thing. It's actually very historical because it's, the other thing is that I think that when George Bolte and the Bishop arrived here, a lot of these photos, because the images in this book actually span from the Western Bay through the Eastern Bay, would be not that dissimilar to what he saw. So once again, thank you very much on behalf of all of us. It was an awesome presentation, and it's a really important event in our calendar here. So thank you very much.
That's right, my pleasure. Thank you.